Now we are going to talk about the depth of field. Before explaining how depth of field works in photography, let us point something about the human eye which is different from the lenses in photography. If a person stands somewhere and looks in front of him, he can see everything in front of him clear. I mean everything from the point he's standing to the last point his vision can see. So everything will be in focus and clear. This is not the case in photography lenses. The lenses allow only a certain area to be clear in focus, and everything before and after this area will be blurry. So this area that is clear or in focus is called the depth of field. And everything before or after this area will be blurred. Let's demonstrate this idea using this example in front of us. Assume we are willing to take a picture for this scenery, and assume that the camera is positioned in this position. Let us rotate the scene so we can see things from another side to see things better. Well, the depth of field is directly related to the aperture value. When the aperture value is small, then the depth of field is small. And when the aperture value is big, the depth of field is big. So let's start demonstrating at f2.8. So at f2.8, it's a small value, so the depth of field will be small. We will demonstrate the blurry area by boxes, by yellow boxes. So everything inside these yellow boxes will be considered as blurred out of focus. And only what is between these two boxes will be the clear visible area, which is the depth of field. So at f2.8, you can see that the depth of field is very narrow. So only small area of the scene will be clear in focus and everything else will be blurred out. Let's increase the depth of field a little bit. Let's go to f8. You can see that more area is now clear and the blurry area is now smaller. Just remember that this is a theoretical example. In other words, in real life, the depth of field might be bigger or smaller than the demonstration here. This is just to demonstrate the idea of depth of field, and it's not the exact area of depth of field. So let's assume that we can go to f32, and we see in that case that the depth of field is very big and most of the image is clear. Only small areas are out of focus or blurred. Some lenses allow an aperture value less than 2.8, like going to f1.8 or 1.6 or even 1.4. So let's demonstrate going to f1.8 or 1.6. So we will assume that this very narrow area is the result of f1.8. Here there are two things that we have to keep in mind. The depth of field is related to the aperture, and the aperture is something related to the lens and not to the camera. Therefore, the first point we have to remember is that every lens has its own aperture values. So, if you are interested to have a very narrow depth of field to do some artistic photography, you have to make sure that this lens has this small aperture number. Many lenses cannot go under f4 or f4.5. Such a lens will not give you the narrow depth of field that you want. On the other hand, in many other cases like shooting landscapes, you are interested to have all the landscape in focus, so you need something like f32 or even more. In that case, you have to make sure that this lens has this, because some lenses cannot go more than f22. So remember that the depth of field is directly related to the aperture value, and not all lenses have all the f values that you need. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is that when you want a big depth of field, a big area in the image to be clear, we are saying that you have to select a big f value like f16, f32. And when you select such big f numbers, it means that the opening in the camera is small, which means less light will enter into your camera. Therefore, when you are willing to have a wide depth of field, you have to make sure that you are shooting in an environment that's really bright and has a lot amount of light, or else you will have underexposed images at the end. So remember that when selecting the lens, you have to read what are the aperture values that this lens has to have the desired depth of field. And remember, when you want wide areas of depth of field, you have to be shooting in bright places. Let us now do some tests on depth of field. I created a simple setup where I put some screws on my desk and I will shoot them using my super macro lens. Why I'm using the super macro lens? This lens has the capability of doing great close-ups and it will display small items in a very big scale on the final result. So we are going to try different aperture values. This lens allows us to reach f2.8 as the minimum value and the maximum value f32. And we are going to see the changes in the depth of field between each f number. The first shot that we are going to take will be at f2.8. Here we notice that only the screw in the middle is in focus. It is inside the depth of field and everything else is out of focus. The second picture will be at f5.6. Here we notice that the picture is becoming more clear. The screws that are near the middle one are more clear than the ones far away, and the depth of field is becoming larger. The next one will be at f8. Also, we can see that things are more clear here, and the screws far away are becoming even more clear, which means that the depth of field is becoming wider. The next picture will be at f16. At f16 you can see that things are much more clear and almost all the screws are visible right now. And the next one will be at f22. Here at f22 we notice that the two screws at the far left and right are more clear than the previous picture. Also the background is more clear. And the last picture will be at f32. And here at f32 we notice that almost everything is clear, and this is the most we can get out of this lens. So this is the widest depth of field possible in this lens. So as we saw, the change in the aperture has a dramatic effect on the depth of field, and we saw different pictures with different depth of fields based on the aperture values that we selected. Well, let's summarize up to this point. What should we know? First of all, we learned the shutter speed, and we learned that the speed of the shutter will affect the quantity of light entering into the camera. If the shutter is fast, then less light will enter into the camera. If the shutter is slow, then more light will enter into the camera. The second thing that we learn is the aperture. So the aperture is related to the opening in the lens, which allows the light to enter into the camera. If this opening is big, more light will enter. If the opening is small, less light will enter. Also, we learned that the aperture also has a big effect, which is the depth of field. When the numerical value of the aperture is big, the depth of field is big. When the numerical value of the aperture is small, then the depth of field is small. Up to this moment, we did not learn how to mix these things together to do our photography. We just learned the shutter speed alone, the aperture alone, the depth of field alone, and we experimented each one of them alone. Later in these tutorials, we are going to see how to relate all these things together and how to mix them to do our photography. So don't worry, with time things will be even more clear and more easy for you. And to tell you from now, there are very nice options in the cameras, in all good professional DSLR cameras, where you can make things easy by focusing only, for example, on the shutter speed, and the camera will calculate the aperture value for you. Or focusing only on the aperture, and the camera will calculate the shutter speed for you. So things are not that difficult. Don't be afraid. The ideas are new. You need little time to grasp them, but then you will move easily and you will understand everything very well.